On the morning of January 1st, 2026, while most of the world was nursing hangovers and making resolutions, Dhaka was watching a young man named Hadi bleed out in the street. To the Western press, it was an instant, pre-written script. A charismatic young leader martyred a clear-cut struggle for democracy, beginning with the first sunrise of the year. You could almost hear the editorial rooms in London and DC frantically typing up headlines about a New Year's revolution and the spring of South Asia. But if you looked closely at the footage of the people actually lighting the matches under those piles of tires, you'd see something far colder and more pragmatic than democratic fervor. They weren't shouting for the right to vote. They were screaming because the very act of voting had become a repetitive, expensive joke that could no longer guarantee physical security or a functioning economy. There was one specific image that went viral that afternoon, a lone protester standing in front of the shuttered gates of a massive garment factory, the shuttering of which signaled the collapse of the nation, the last remaining lifeline. He wasn't holding a sign about free speech or civil liberties. He was holding a rusted piece of scrap metal and staring toward the horizon, specifically toward the massive, half-finished bridge projects and digital backbones funded by the continental powers to the north. To him, and thousands like him, Hadi's death wasn't a call to restore the process. It was the final, bloody proof that the process itself was a bankrupt transplant. It's a strained, almost detached feeling to watch a nation realize that procedural justice is a luxury they can no longer afford. For decades, Bangladesh was told its destiny was tied to the maritime alliances of the Atlantic. Yet, as the smoke cleared in early 2026, the rage wasn't just directed at a single regime, but at a civilizational model that exports political theater while the physical state atrophies. It forces a question that makes Western analysts incredibly uncomfortable. What happens when a society decides that a high-speed rail line and a stable command post are worth more than a dozen free and fair elections? This is the story of South Asia's black swan and the brutal civilizational gambit that is currently reshaping the map.
That event, what you just described in Dhaka, it really wasn't a political crisis in the way we usually think of it.
Yeah.
It was more like a societal fever finally breaking.
The physical manifestation of something that had been rotting for years.
Exactly. I mean, you can see it as an epitaph, really, an epitaph for this.
Yeah.
This failed transplant of the Western model, this idea of electoral theater, onto post-colonial soil.
So for this deep dive, we're not just looking at a coup or a protest. We're looking at something much deeper.
That's the mission. To recognize that this isn't just a struggle for one type of government over another.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental civilizational question. What happens when the state fails at its most basic, its most primary function?
Which is to provide order.
To provide order, that's it.
Yeah.
And that's really the key takeaway from all the material we've looked at. It challenges this core liberal assumption that if you just have the right process, stability will automatically follow. But here, the process, it became the problem itself. Yeah, so we have to start with this fundamental theorem. The health of any civilization, is predicated on the state's capacity to provide order, physical security, and, crucially, economic predictability.
The basics.
The absolute basics. When that core function atrophies, when the state can't even guarantee reliable power or functional roads or safe streets, well, the anger you saw in the streets of Dhaka, that wasn't some democratic yearning for a ballot box. It was a violent spasm against a chronic systemic failure.
People are just looking for something that works.
They're looking for a system that works, period. Regardless of what you call it, regardless of the ideological label you slap on it. And our job today is to really unpack this massive shift, this move away from a reliance on that failing Western political model to a system that is focused, laser-focused on stability and physical state capacity.
Okay, so let's start where that lone protester was looking. Toward the horizon, toward the continental powers. We have to set the geopolitical scene here because for centuries, the world was really defined by this tension, wasn't it? The tension between sea power and the massive Eurasian landmass.
You absolutely have to understand the classical geopolitical framework to see why this is all happening right now. For the better part of, 3 centuries, global strategy was guided by the doctrine of sea power.
This is Alfred Thayer Mahan.
That's the one. Mahan, his famous dictum, and it really shaped everything, was whoever rules the waves rules the world.
And that explains the British Empire perfectly. And then later, the U.S. global strategy. You control the water, you control global trade.
Precisely. The British understood this instinctively. They controlled the essential maritime choke point, Suez, the Strait of Malacca. The U.S. global strategy basically inherited this playbook. It established absolute supremacy over the Atlantic and Pacific, and that's what allowed it to enforce the liberal international order, to safeguard global trade.
So for a country like Bangladesh, for decades after decolonization, its whole world was oriented toward the sea.
Completely. Its economic destiny, its alliances, its strategic thinking, it was all tied to the maritime alliances of the Atlantic. It had to rely on secure sea lanes that ultimately depended on navies thousands of miles away.
But the core tension that we're seeing now is the return of what the classic geopoliticians called the heartland. The Eurasian landmass is re-emerging as a power center, and it fundamentally challenges that sea-based dominance.
It does. The heartland, and we're talking about a vast area, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Siberia, it holds immense, and for a long time, largely untapped natural resources. Plus, it's defined by its defensible terrain.
It was the center of the ancient world with things like the Silk Road.
The original Silk Road, exactly. And now, the economic and demographic gravity of the world is shifting back to that landmass. The rise of continental powers, obviously China most notably, benefits immensely from these favorable geographic circumstances. They can leverage land-based connectivity rail, pipelines, fiber optics to project power and economic integration across the largest continent on Earth. And that it completely changes the calculus for the countries on the edge, the rimland nations like Bangladesh.
So this looks like a classic collision course.
Yeah.
But, and this is the big but, direct conflict between major nuclear powers is, well, it's functionally impossible.
That is the pivotal constraint of our entire era. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, has profoundly reshaped how great powers compete. Since 1945, we've seen incredibly fierce rivalry, but we have not seen a full-scale direct military conflict between nuclear-armed states. The cost is just. It's unthinkable.
So the rivalry doesn't disappear, it just moves, it changes its methods.
Correct, it shifts. And that is where Nicholas Spykman's concept of the rimland becomes intensely relevant.
The coastal periphery of Eurasia.
The coastal periphery. If you can't fight directly in the heartland, you fight for influence, for infrastructure, for alliances in the rimland. And that is South Asia's geopolitical reality today. This area is often a non-nuclear zone, which means conflicts here are much less likely to escalate into a global nuclear war.
Which makes it the primary battleground.
The primary battleground for everything. For proxy wars, for economic sanctions, for technological competition. All of it aimed at controlling this absolutely crucial periphery.
So for Bangladesh, sitting right on that hinge, the strategic choices become existential.
Utterly existential. For decades, they were firmly within what you might call the sphere of the Atlantic-New Delhi axis. This meant their economic and political choices were heavily constrained by the maritime orientation of those dominant powers. But that system, you can see it showing signs of internal stress, of decline.
So the choice they face now is what? Stick with the old system.
The choice is between remaining tethered to that old and frankly increasingly brittle maritime system or integrating into this burgeoning Eurasian system that's being built on high-speed rail, fiber optic cables, and energy corridors. The latter offers a kind of physical terrestrial security that sea-based alliances, which depend on distant fleets and are vulnerable to choke points, they just can't guarantee anymore. That protester in Dhaka, he was staring right at that future.
Let's move from that huge macro map down to the functional failure that actually starked the crisis. Because the chaos in Dhaka wasn't just, a result of bad policy. It was a symptom of a really deep, systemic, institutional decay. The source material frames this as social entropy and the political gridlock it causes as Vitocracy.
Yes, and we have to move past the superficial political narrative to really look at the engine room of the state. The crisis and the assassination that triggered it was at its heart a functional failure of governance. And the central problem of the Western procedural model as it was transplanted is this system of Vitocracy.
I find that term really powerful. If democracy is about choice and action, Vitocracy sounds like the opposite, paralysis. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, Vitocracy is a system where you have numerous factions. It could be political parties, vested interests, judicial blocs, entrenched bureaucracies, even powerful non-state actors. And each one of them possesses the functional power to stop any major initiative.
They can all say no.
They can all say no, but, and this is the critical part, none of them possess the power to start or complete one. So the state's entire institutional energy is just consumed by this chronic zero-sum political struggle.
And that creates what you call social entropy, a slow decay.
A steady decline of the state's capacity to do anything functional at all. Instead of prioritizing tangible material outcomes like, say, a new power plant or a functional port, the system prioritizes the political process itself. The electoral theater becomes the main event.
It becomes an end in itself.
Exactly. And the ultimate consequence, which we saw so tragically in Dhaka, is that the state loses its ability to provide the basic functions of civilization. I mean, think about the garment sector. The absolute lifeblood of Bangladesh's economy was literally collapsing as that riot began.
And we have that story from the production manager, Annika, who saw this decay firsthand. How does she describe what was happening?
Anika was working in a textile hub in Gazipur. And for her, the 2026 unrest wasn't some lofty struggle for political rights. She saw it as a desperate, violent plea for function, just for things to work.
So what did she see day to day?
She described years where critical infrastructure upgrades, simple things like trying to secure a consistent power supply or modernizing the logistics chains to get textiles to port, were constantly vetoed or just stalled indefinitely.
And why? Why would they be stalled?
Because every single major project became a bargaining chip in the endless political maneuvering. A simple power grid upgrade could be vetoed by a local opposition party or tied up in a judicial challenge or just buried in bureaucratic delay, all because of political infighting.
Wow.
So for someone like Anika, the sophisticated language of financial derivatives or these Western platitudes about procedural fairness, they're meaningless. They're worthless when the production lines are standing silent. And this underlines a really crucial point that I think the continental strategists understand very well.
Which is?
That only physical, tangible output, the textiles actually shipped, the power actually generated, the roads actually built, only that constitutes real geopolitical power. A state that cannot maintain its own industrial supply chain has failed its primary duty. It has failed to provision order.
Okay, so if the Western procedural model fails through this kind of institutional paralysis, this Vitocracy, what's the alternative? What is the competing model being put forward by the continental powers? The sources call it the East Asian administrative model.
Yes, and this is really the antithesis of Vitocracy. We're talking about the developmental state, or DS. And this template is defined by two things: administrative primacy and metric-driven execution.
So the focus is fundamentally long-term.
Completely long-term. The goal isn't winning the next election cycle. The goal is what they call the generational relay. You have engineers and planners working together towards coherent 30-year national blueprints.
That's a massive paradigm shift. So if the goal isn't vote secured, what are the metrics? How do you define success in a developmental state?
They are concrete. They are measurable metrics of physical capacity. How many factories were built this year? What was the national increase in per capita electricity consumption? How many patents were filed in core technological sectors? What's the sustained GDP growth rate?
And this model came out of the big success stories in East Asia.
It did. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore.
Yeah.
These places achieved truly exceptional sustained growth rates. We're talking 6% or higher for multiple decades in a row. That is extraordinary in economic history.
So let's talk about that first version, DS 1.0, the one that enabled that rapid catch-up phase. What were the core mechanisms that let these nations just leapfrog the traditional stages of development?
Well, the first thing is that DS 1.0 fundamentally rejected the neoliberal Washington consensus. It rejected the belief that if you just get prices right and have totally unfettered free trade, success will be guaranteed.
It's not that simple.
It's not that simple. Instead, the developmental state involved strong, centralized steering of production. You needed an elite consensus, a group at the top that was absolutely dedicated to high, sustained growth above all else.
So the state is actively managing the economy. It's not just a referee. But how did they manage trade and capital flows without just collapsing into inefficiency and corruption?
That's the key question. They used very sophisticated managed trade policies. For example, duty drawback schemes. They would give exporters back the cost of any imported inputs they used. This made them instantly competitive on the global market while still protecting nascent domestic industries from being wiped out.
And they controlled capital, too.
They used capital controls to prevent financial instability, and they used targeted subsidies or protection for key industries. But, and this is the crucial caveat, this support was always conditional. It wasn't a permanent handout.
So the state was essentially making a bargain with its industries. It was saying, we will protect you, but you must perform.
Precisely. The state would grant protection, but the firms had performance conditions they had to meet. They had to close the price and quality gap with international imports within a certain time frame, or they had to invest heavily in pushing out the technological frontier.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. South Korea, for instance, would often mandate that a high percentage of local nationals had to be employed in any new high-tech project. The goal was to ensure rapid skills transfer. They wanted to maximize the transfer of technology itself, not just import finished goods.
That seems so much more robust than the simple idea of just opening up the markets. It's managed development.
It is. I mean, the Taiwanese central bank, for instance, learned a very harsh lesson from the Asian financial crisis. Afterwards, they covertly built deep controls into their banking system, long after they had publicly committed to trade liberalization.
Why?
To protect their economy against what they called the anti-catch-up effects of sudden destabilizing financialization. The aim was to ensure that the core economic base, the physical production, was never, ever threatened by speculative finance.
But did that kind of intense state steering survive? I mean, with globalization and the rise of these complex, integrated global value chains, did the model have to die?
It adapted. It evolved into what we call DS 2.0. The developmental mindset proved to be remarkably resilient. Some Western observers argued, that these states had just become neoliberal with a few legacy quirks. But the evidence shows they simply shifted their focus.
Shifted from what to what?
They shifted from basic manufacturing catch-up to mission-oriented innovation policies.
Okay, what does that look like in the modern knowledge-based economy? Give us some clear examples of DS 2.0 in action.
Look at South Korea's 577 program. The goal was clearly defined. Invest 5% of the national GDP into R&D, focus it on 7 major technological areas, with the aim of becoming one of the world's 7 major science and technology economies. That is centralized, long-term strategic direction.
It's a national mission.
It's a national mission. Or look at Taiwan. They created the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, which employs thousands of researchers. It acts as a national technology incubator, and it actively makes it easy for scientists to spin off their research into commercial applications.
So the state isn't just funding abstract research, it's actively facilitating the commercialization and transfer of that knowledge directly into the economy.
Correct. They also established the Science and Technology Advisory Group, STAG, which includes foreign advisors who scrutinize new initiatives. This ensures that the centralized push remains informed and globally competitive. And it's this continuous capacity for centralized directional action, the engineers working toward the 30-year blueprint, not the next quarterly result, that promotes what we call civilizational firewalls.
Firewalls against what, exactly?
Firewalls against disruptive mental models, against short-term political populism, against the kind of financial volatility that just cripples any attempt at long-term investment. The political arrangements in many of these states, often centralized power structures, coupled with strong socialization and patriotism and collective purpose, that's what allowed for decades of fast growth and low enough inequality to generate mass consent.
Even if it meant suppressing certain kinds of political dissent.
Even with that trade-off, yes.
Yeah.
And that entire structure is the polar opposite of the Vitocracy we saw paralyze Dhaka.
That centralized capacity leads us directly to the physical solution that's now being implemented. The rage in Dhaka, as we said, was directed at a model that exports political theater while the physical state just atrophies. The response from the continental powers is physical infrastructure, tangible, heavy, and undeniable.
We are witnessing the return of geodeterminism. The idea that material reality, the ability to physically move goods, energy, and data, is what dictates strategy and alliance formation. For nations like Bangladesh, allegiance is now being reshaped not by diplomatic statements, but by tangible utility.
The competition is measured in hard metrics.
Exactly. The speed of rail freight, the modernized Chittagong port tonnage, the latency reduction of fiber optic digital backbones, the load-bearing calculus of heavy infrastructure.
Which brings us back to those massive projects the Dhaka protester was looking at, like the Padma Bridge.
The Padma Bridge. It's a $3.6 billion project, but it's so much more than a piece of concrete. It is an economic artery. It's estimated to boost the national GDP by 1.2% every single year.
That's a concrete, non-negotiable measure of state capacity.
It is, delivered by centralized administrative focus. Just compare the certainty of that 1.2% GDP boost to the chaos and paralysis of the Vitocracy that preceded it.
And regionally, the centerpiece of this entire physical overhaul has to be CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
CPEC is, you could argue, the single most important pilot project of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Rimland. It's fundamentally designed to enhance regional connectivity between China, Pakistan, and the broader Eurasian belt. Its whole function is to link the heartland, the landlocked western parts of China, and the Central Asian republics with the Rimland. Specifically, with the deep-sea port of Gwadar on the Indian Ocean.
And why is that specific linkage to Gwadar so strategically vital for China and for the Central Asian republics, the CARs?
Well, for the CARs, it's simple. It provides the shortest and cheapest trade route to access the open ocean. It dramatically reduces their dependence on Russian or Iranian transit routes. But for China, it offers a vital alternative to the dreaded Malacca Dilemma.
The strategic choke point.
The ultimate strategic choke point.
Can you just explain the Malacca Dilemma clearly? What is the logistical risk that it poses?
Okay, so currently, China imports a huge amount of its energy needs. It's around 60% today, projected to reach 75% soon, and it all comes via the 12,000-kilometer Malacca Strait route. The strait is narrow, it's heavily trafficked, and crucially, it's a choke point that is controlled by maritime powers.
Also with a crisis.
In a crisis scenario, a distant navy could impose a crippling blockade there. It could starve China of the energy and raw materials it needs to maintain its entire industrial base. It's an existential vulnerability.
So CPEC, by building high-speed rail, pipelines, and roads straight from Western China to Gwadar, it fundamentally changes that whole strategic calculus. It's a secure, shorter alternative.
It's an act of deep civilizational resilience, and it transforms the regional geopolitics. It moves the focus away from conventional military conflict to pure geoeconomics. The vision is to encourage integration, to shift the focus from historical animosities like between Pakistan and India to shared economic prosperity. The hope is to create a Sino-Pac-India geoeconomic triangle.
And other powers are noticing this.
Of course. We've even seen Russia express serious interest in joining this growing economic venture. This massive investment in continental integration is designed to make regional cooperation inevitable, to make it more profitable than conflict.
So what does this massive macro shift look like when you zoom right down to the local level, to the logistics chain? We have the story of Kabir.
Kabir's story it's the perfect illustration of how physical certainty restores a sense of order. He's a logistics foreman in Rajshahi, and for 20 years he described watching trucks and produce literally rot in monsoon mud.
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there. Because the local infrastructure was non-existent and the political gridlock meant nothing was ever repaired. His entire livelihood was dictated by chaos. Now in 2026, he's overseeing a massive inland rail terminal. He's clearing freight trains that are arriving directly from the Eurasian heartland.
He is physically seeing his livelihood get decoupled from that unstable, distant maritime world.
Exactly. He's looking at tangible iron tracks. He is witnessing a restoration of order through the sheer capacity to move things reliably. His economic security is no longer reliant on the whims of a distant navy controlling a faraway strait or on the veto power of some local politician. That physical certainty, that's the ultimate attractor for local communities who are just tired of political theater. They want their goods to move, their factories to run, and their supply chains to be secure. Simple as that.
But order requires more than just physical infrastructure, right? It also requires financial stability. And when the global financial system is increasingly seen as being weaponized, nations start looking for what the sources call civilizational resilience by actively opting out of the dominant system. We're talking about de-dollarization.
This is a direct, logical response to the weaponization of economic sanctions and the U.S.-controlled SWIFT system. I mean, think about it. When the U.S. Treasury can unilaterally impose controls over global financial transactions, any nation that relies on the U.S. dollar or the SWIFT mechanism is fundamentally exposed.
They're vulnerable.
They're incredibly vulnerable. So nations are compelled to de-dollarize simply to maintain their sovereignty and their independence from undue coercion.
What is the true magnitude of this shift? I mean, we all know the dollar is still dominant, but where exactly is its grip weakening?
It's weakening significantly in the key areas that relate to long-term national wealth and sovereign debt. So while the U.S. dollar is still king in day-to-day foreign exchange transactions, about 88%, and in trade invoicing, around 40%, its grip on global finance is softening.
Where specifically?
Most critically, its share in foreign currency reserves, the actual wealth that nations hold, has dropped dramatically. It went from 90% in 1960 to just 45% in 2023, and in the global bond market, its share has fallen to around 30%.
So its dominance is declining where nations store their long-term value and where they issue their debt. That sounds like a strategic hedge against future dollar instability or, as you said, weaponization.
That's precisely what it is. And this decline has led to the active construction of alternatives. Nations are building parallel financial infrastructure to bypass the U.S. control system entirely. The BRICS nations are developing BRICS Pay. Russia has its SPFS system, India has SFMS, and most significantly, China's CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, is growing incredibly fast.
Okay, let's focus on CIPS for a second. What makes it a viable alternative to SWIFT, given that SWIFT has this massive entrenched global network?
CIPS is the mechanism for yuan-denominated cross-border clearing and settlement. Its viability comes down to network effects. It already connects over 1,400 financial institutions across more than 110 countries and regions. Now, that network is smaller than SWIFT, of course, but its growth shows a powerful strategic commitment. It allows nations to conduct transactions entirely outside the U.S. dollar sphere, which minimizes their exposure to U.S. secondary sanctions.
And we're seeing the most visible shifts in the real economy, in energy and bilateral trade agreements. That's where the decoupling really begins, isn't it?
Absolutely. In commodities, the changes are profound. Major economies like India, China, Brazil, they're all buying discounted oil and gas from sanctioned nations, and they're bypassing SWIFT and settling payments in their own local currencies.
This is even affecting traditional U.S. allies.
It is. In January 2023, Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 48 years, expressed openness to trading its oil in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. Think about that. Even Ghana is working to buy oil using its gold reserves. This fundamentally alters that old commodity for USD paradigm.
And the bilateral trade agreements seem to be creating these localized financial islands very, very quickly.
That's the core strategy. It's about building redundancy. China and Brazil struck a deal in March 2023 to conduct trade using their own currencies, the yuan and the real. This just eliminates the need for the USD as an intermediary. Argentina, facing shrinking dollar reserves, started paying for Chinese imports in yuan. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, reported that 97% of trade among its members in 2025 was conducted in local currencies.
This isn't accidental.
It's not incidental at all. It's a systematic strategy to gain transactional sovereignty and to strengthen regional economic blocs against any external financial pressures.
So given India's massive economic footprint in South Asia, where does their strategy fit into this huge financial pivot? Are they all in on de-dollarization?
India's strategy is, well, it's highly sophisticated and very pragmatic. It's less about outright de-dollarization and more about diversification and building resilience. So they're increasing their gold reserves and their multi-currency reserves, strategically hedging against dollar volatility. And crucially, they are promoting the international use of the rupee.
How are they doing that?
Through mechanisms like local currency settlement agreements and the creation of something called special rupee vostro accounts, or SRVAs.
Those SRVAs sound like a key piece of the puzzle. They allow other countries to hold rupee balances to facilitate trade without converting to dollars first, right?
It's exactly right. We know that 22 countries have already opened these SRVAs. This makes rupee-denominated trade much easier, it lowers transaction costs, and it reduces reliance on the fluctuating dollar. On top of that, India is internationalizing its Unified Payments Interface, or UPI, making it a viable alternative for small-scale cross-border digital payments.
Bypassing SWIFT for retail and small businesses?
Bypassing SWIFT vulnerability at the ground level, yeah.
And that brings us to Rahim, the small-scale electronics importer. His story really seems to encapsulate this whole financial decoupling perfectly.
Rahim's anxiety was the anxiety of the old system. He was a small operator, but his entire inventory, his family's livelihood, it was all tied to decisions being made thousands of miles away by the Federal Reserve. Every time the Fed adjusted interest rates, he'd be in a cold sweat, worrying about the exchange rate risk wiping him out.
In the chaos of the 2026 crisis, his business should have folded.
It should have. But he used these new, emerging continental financial structures. He pivoted hard and fast. He used the first wave of local currency swap agreements to pay for his inventory in takas and yuans. And this wasn't just a smart business decision. For him, it was an act of financial sovereignty.
He decoupled his own life.
He decoupled his small operation from that fragile, maritime-centered debt system and linked himself directly to the stable, logistics-driven continental reality. For him, that move secured his life in a way that no distant platitude about free capital flows ever could.
So this entire pivot, the shift toward centralized administrative capacity, physical continental infrastructure, and financial autonomy, this all comes with unavoidable social and philosophical consequences. We have to talk about the profound trade-offs that are inherent in these competing civilizational models.
This is the critical, necessary step in this deep dive. We've established that the Western procedural model often leads to institutional decay and Vitocracy, but we have to acknowledge its promise of individual liberty. Yet the sources reveal a growing internal realization in developed Western societies of the very high human cost of prioritizing maximum individualism. And that cost is intense social fragmentation.
The idea that the only thing binding the culture together is consumerism, leaving people wealthy but fundamentally lonely.
Precisely. When industrial wealth and bureaucratic social services, the welfare state, the formalized systems, when they replace the roles that were previously held by extended family, by neighbors, by voluntary associations, social cohesion just declines dramatically. We call a high trust in systems, but it leads to low trust or low reliance on people.
And that creates profound loneliness.
It does. I heard a friend say once that the tragic flaw of the extreme West is that you can die alone in your apartment and nobody would notice for weeks. That is the hidden price of maximum independence. The systems have become so efficient that they almost make us obsolete to each other.
And they profit from it.
They do. The system profits from and encourages that isolation. It reframes reliance on another person as a kind of personal failure. A culture where you don't need to lean on your family or your community very easily becomes a culture where you cannot do so without facing stigma.
So conversely, the communal model, which is often prevalent in South Asian or East Asian societies, seems tightly knit, maybe excessively so.
That tight-knit nature, which prevents loneliness, is often born out of material necessity. When social services are weak or scarce, reliance on family, on your clan, on your community, it's a prerequisite for survival. But this strong communal reliance is a two-edged sword.
How so?
While it offers deep, necessary social support and prevents that isolation we see in the West, it strictly demands conformity and obedience to group norms.
So what's the actual trade-off for the individual who's seeking stability in this highly conformist environment?
The oppressive side can be immense. There's very limited personal flexibility. We read that story of the user whose wife wanted to be a photographer, but was forced into a tourism career because it offered greater family status and more financial stability. You have toxic family dynamics where obligation replaces genuine affection. Intense pressure on career and marriage choices.
And for anyone who doesn't conform.
For anyone who deviates, nonconformists, atheists, LGBTQ individuals, or even women who are just seeking self-determination life, can be an oppressive nightmare. If you don't fit the mold, the community will actively and often brutally try to hammer you down into line. And what's more, this high social cohesion often rests very heavily on the unpaid domestic and emotional labor of women. The cooking, the cleaning, the emotional catering that keeps that tight-knit social fabric intact. Many women across the Rimland are actively weighing this traditional, tightly bound support system against the individual freedom and self-determination available in the West.
So we are facing a global civilizational binary choice, a high-trust, individualized society that risks social emptiness and institutional decay through Vitocracy, or a tight-knit developmental state society that provides function and stability but risks oppression and the stifling of individual liberty.
That is the inescapable tension, and the nations of the Rimland are grappling with this choice in real time. Right now, they are searching desperately for some kind of middle ground that provides both economic function, the working power grid, and social structure, the support network, without the oppressive cost of either extreme. The choice is fundamentally about whether a society prioritizes maximum self-determination or maximum communal stability. And the Dhaka riots were a verdict that for them, the lack of function had become a greater immediate crisis than the lack of freedom.
So let's bring the thread all the way back to Dhaka, back to the Black Swan of 2026. The assassination of Hadi and the chaos that followed was a brutal verdict on the functional failure of one specific model.
It was a local, bloody manifestation of what you could call the irreversible thermodynamic entropy of the liberal order. The system had just dissipated all its institutional energy into procedural complexity, into Vitocracy, to the point where it could no longer generate any kind of coherent, collective, or long-term action. That inability to manage the fundamentals, that's what brought the state to its knees.
And the decisive attractor for nations like Bangladesh is changing. They are no longer looking for ideological aid or conditional loans tied to political reforms.
The attraction now is the pragmatic development toolkit being offered by the continental powers. It's turnkey infrastructure, it's concrete capacity building, and crucially, it's respect for political autonomy without ideological lectures. This stands in stark contrast to conditional aid packages and what some now view as the cognitive virus of the democracy narrative, which they see as a disruptive force designed to trigger systemic failure rather than foster stable growth.
So the nations that will define this coming century are those focused entirely on functional capacity.
The choice that was revealed by the 2026 crisis is stark, and it's binary: order or oblivion. The future belongs to those nations that focus not on the emotional turbulence of the next election cycle, but on the next generation of physical state capacity on building ports, high-speed rail, financial resilience, and strong centralized administrative systems that are capable of delivering functional, predictable lives for their citizens. That is the true civilizational gambit that is now reshaping South Asia.